there are several kinds of altitudes. First of all, if you look at your altimeter and you read your altimeter, you'll read indicated altitude. So indicated altitude is basically what your altimeter reads. You just read it right off your altimeter. But true altitude is really what it would read if it's reading correctly, and that tells you the vertical distance of the aircraft above sea level. So if your altimeter is reading correctly, it tells you true altitude, and that's how high you are above sea level. Now, indicated altitude and true altitude may not always be the same. So true altitude is how high you are above sea level. Now, absolute altitude is how high you are above the terrain that you're flying over at the time. Now, the terrain goes up and down, and altimeters tell you how high you are above sea level, but not how high you are above the terrain unless you have a radar altimeter. It's shooting a radar beam down. So your absolute altitude is something you normally don't know unless you calculate it. If you know the height of the terrain and you know your true altitude, you can figure out the absolute altitude by subtracting, but that's the only way you would know it. So absolute altitude is the vertical distance of the aircraft above the surface. That's the absolute altitude. Finally, let's take a look at pressure altitude. Pressure altitude is what you get when you put 29.92 in the little setting window of your altimeter. It's the indicated altitude when the barometric pressure scale, the setting scale, is set to 29.92, and it tells you how far you are above sea level at standard pressure. Now, normally in real life, you're never really at standard pressure, so this 29.92 pressure level moves up and down. It may or may not be at sea level. Almost always it won't exactly be at sea level. And so it tells you how far you are above the standard pressure level, which is 29.92, which may be different than your true altitude. Why do you care about pressure altitude? Well, because you'll normally use it in the performance charts when you're calculating the performance of the aircraft. You use it as a starting spot in the performance calculations of the aircraft, and that's pressure altitude. So those are the altitudes real quickly. First of all, indicated altitude is what your altimeter reads. True altitude is the vertical distance of the aircraft above sea level. Absolute altitude is the vertical distance of the aircraft above the surface, and pressure altitude is what you get when you put 29.92 in the setting window of the altimeter, and it tells you how far you are above the standard pressure level of 29.92. So that's what your altimeter tells you.